any organization, and it could be a sports team, it could be a Masonic order, it could be a university, it could be a major corporation, are measured and I think judged on the basis of the effectiveness and the tone of their operational units. We tend to call those teams. And I really believe that. I've seen it evolve within the university. I was at a university for 43 years. I saw that university evolve. I saw teams grow. I saw effective leadership. I saw passionate leadership. I saw detached leadership. I saw a number of different types of leaders within that organization, Ryerson University. And I can tell you the leader and the teams they form and how those teams operate can make a significant difference. And I think what I'm talking today is scalable. It can relate to a small unit, it can relate to a large unit, in some cases it can relate to a country. So I think this whole idea of the health of organizations and the teams they create and implement are extremely, extremely important. And I think increasingly organizations are looking at the effectiveness of those teams going forth in complex and challenging environments. And all organizations are faced with those challenges. So I'm going to talk a little bit about successful teams, types of teams, how hopefully you build a team environment, develop a collaborative culture within that organization, which fits very well with what Nancy was talking about, and finish with what I normally do, some quotes, which I think are hopefully inspirational and hopefully have been developed by people a lot brighter than I am. If we start looking, there's a number of ways you can define teams. There's a whole series of teams you could categorize. These are the ones that we all would go to now. If we went to Google, we all seem to think Google is the font of knowledge. And if you went to Google, they would outline these teams. Well, the executive team, obviously, we've experienced those. They're the senior management team. They're the ones that develop the strategy, and their job is to implement that strategy through working with groups who report generally to them. It's generally the CEO, the CFO, the COO, the CIO, the CTO, almost the GTO. But they generally have a general counsel there to make the team appear to be legitimate in terms of the legal issues and governance issues, etc. They can make a significant difference. They generally come up with a strategic plan. In the case of Ryerson University, the academic plan. And they're a very important part of the organization. The most important part is how do they communicate? How do they translate their vision into the rest of the organization? There's obviously project teams where you bring in experts. Anytime I saw a project team come to look at my environments, I wondered if they were going to close me down. But nonetheless, project teams are important. They're made up of specialists. There's a special task at hand, and they try to make things a little better within the organization. Advisory teams, generally fairly targeted. Again, you bring in experts to provide counsel about a particular issue. They're not working necessarily on a project. They're in effect providing overarching advice. And more importantly, I think you can think of a work team, an action team. A good example of an action team I would suggest is the Navy SEALs in the United States. Particular task, particular skills, and they get it done. And increasingly, we're dealing with virtual teams. The notion that people are in different parts of the world. They're perhaps international. They work 24/7. And what they really lack in some cases is social interaction. But in effect, they are constantly working on issues. I had the opportunity this week to be in a small town in Iowa. And this town in Iowa has this incredible research unit. And in effect, who links into that research unit are people from around the world. And they're talking about a very specialized thing, imaging, and color images, and the permanence of color. A thing I knew nothing about. And why I was there was quite magical, I think. I was there to see whether or not that organization could be brought to Canada as a research unit. But anyway, we're constantly aware of teams, and if you're in Canada, and particularly in Toronto, you're aware of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Well, what a team that is, you see. And you have to understand context in understanding that team. That team was once a championship team. And during that period of time, they had a certain type of leader. And they had a certain image and a certain culture. And the context of the environment was farm team. They could control farm teams and develop the culture of being a Toronto Maple Leaf. Never the star, but the team. That was Conn Smythe's image. And then you had change. You had change take place. And a new management group, new owner, new leader, Harold Ballard. A different view of the Toronto Maple Leafs. A cash box on Carlton, I think the term was coined. And in effect, what Ballard tried to do, and later on, they tried to buy the teams. That's when Toronto Maple Leafs could use their money and hopefully buy. And then a whole new context. It was called the cap. Toronto Maple Leafs didn't know how to deal with the cap. And gradually now, under new management, they're looking at the draft as the savior. And they bring in a really interesting team. They bought what they think is the best team. They bought Shanahan in, they bought Lou Lamoriello in, they bought Mark Hunter in, and they've got people dealing with all sorts of specialties from metrics to, in effect, trying to build a team. And they've convinced stupid people like me it's perhaps possible, because I'm a subscriber. Anyway, I'm ever hopeful. Anyway, what we're really looking at, obviously, is high-performing teams. And I could argue teams, whether they're good or bad, really shape the culture of the organization. And teams are just not putting people in a room. That doesn't work. And the best performing teams capture what Nancy talked about. They really capture about how do you deal with complex challenges working together in a collaborative way? And how do you affect change? And collaboration doesn't mean you don't have disagreement. Collaboration doesn't mean you don't have dissent. Collaboration doesn't mean you don't have challenges, but you do it in a certain way. And that's sort of some of the issues I've challenged with, I guess, over my time as dean. So I'm going to talk about perhaps how you create these teams, how all members of the team really have to understand their role and their objective and, in effect, what they're there for. And that's an extremely important element in team formation. How do you create a team? And I think of the team that Bill created, or I don't know who created it, I'm assuming Bill created it, about leadership. How was that group brought together? How did Bill ask people to participate? What skills did they have? And what were some of the challenges in developing leadership modules? And I know there were some in developing those modules. And how did that team work together to develop something for this organization? Well, there are some, I suppose, rules, or what is normally called the 12 C's of forming teams. And I think the first one is to clearly set the expectations. Time expectations. What do you want to accomplish over a certain period of time? If you don't start off with that conversation, you can, in effect, become ineffective. The next one is, I really do believe you have to understand context. At Ryerson, over the last couple of years, I've set up a leadership program for academics. And academics are some of the worst people to work in teams. They're almost impossible. They're individual thinkers. They think they're smarter than everyone else. They are really interesting people. They're individuals. But yet they have to work in teams. And to understand the context of why they're there is extremely important. And universities are changing, the environment's changing, technology's changing, new ways of teaching are changing, new financial models are upon us. And do not understand that before you go into a team environment to work on a solution, I think you're working at cross purposes, or in some cases in a world that isn't really real. Team members often have to be committed. They have to be there for the right reason. I made some horrible decisions as dean forming teams. Horrible decisions, and I learned from those. I wanted to have a curricular review within the Ted Rogers School of Management. It's a big school, 10,000 students, 11 different departments, and I thought it was important to reassess the curriculum for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So what I did was I selected the team. As dean, I had that approval. And the most political thing to do, the correct thing to do, political correct thing to do, was to ask the chairs of each department to perhaps either select an individual or participate themselves. Great idea, Ken. They all selected themselves. Not what I really wanted, but I wanted to be cooperative. I wanted to engage. I wanted to be, the dean who really asked people to participate in the process. And when I quickly found out self-interest is a very, very omnipotent presence. No one could get past, or very few could get past, what the impact on their department would be. To even suggest that course A wouldn't be in the first year, where most of the students were, hence many of the resources, was simply not a discussion point for many. So this project went on for about a year and a half, and it got nowhere. There's no change. There's increased animosity in anything. And I'm getting frustrated. I'm wasting time, etc. And so I suggested this was going nowhere. Let's disband the team. Okay, we're going to stop curricular review. Well, that didn't make much sense either. We weren't interested in education going forward. So I stepped back and said, well, I'm not going to lead the team. I'm going to get someone else to lead the team. So I got someone who was much more maybe engaging than I was, an associate dean, and in effect, she selected young people from each department. Newer people who had a vision, who in effect saw themselves being there 10, 15 years in. And that team was much more effective. And they actually started to work towards significant curriculum reform. A whole new view of the curriculum, looking at competencies as more important than disciplines, looking at leadership, innovation, entrepreneurship as the more important items rather than accounting, finance, marketing. Those things, in effect, fit in to building the more integrated, if you want, business graduate. So members of the team have to have the right competencies, and the team has to be empowered. There has to be some sort of control, and that means the team has to have leadership. And it has to be collaborative. They have to, in effect, work together as a team. Moving forward on these various C's, I think one of the more important was you have to communicate constantly. If a team is working in isolation and you're working on a major project, if you're not communicating, those are going to be affected. The team tends to take on a life of its own, and probably the end product will not be received very well. It'll become detached from the reality, detached from the environment, the context in which you're operating. I think optimally team members are creative. They understand the consequences of their actions, and that's something I learned as well. I can give you a prime example, and I know there's people at Ryerson here, so hopefully this doesn't get back. As a dean, I realized that the business school, and I accepted that, was a source of revenue for the rest of the university. No problem. Business courses can be developed effectively. There's a lot of students, and there would be monies generated out of the business school that would be put into other programs. I have no problem with that. But then I started to realize that a number of our students were taking evening courses, degree courses at evening. Perfect, no problem. It means they can perhaps have a less of a commute one day. They could take a course at night and have time to do other things. It was giving them some flexibility, all sorts of good things. And then I realized that over time, the amount of money I was getting was being reduced. Our faculty was growing, and I was getting a smaller budget. How was this happening? Well, I realized that rather than getting X dollars for each student that was taking a day course, I was getting X minus Y if they were taking a night course. And the Y was equivalent to about $300 a student. Oh. And then I found out the number of students taking the evening courses were from 200 to 500 to 1,000, so about 3,000 courses. Well, 3,000 times 300 is a lot of money. So the dean puffs himself up and makes a passionate plea, this can't happen. And what I didn't realize, that money was being used by the president to do big things for the university. All right? So all of a sudden, I'm challenging the president. That's not a good thing. Because in my contract basically says I can be dismissed without cause. Well, that certainly was cause. So, the hidden information is really an important thing when you're dealing with consequences of teams. Making sure what the consequences of the actions of the team are and how they're going to be received. And finally, obviously, coordination is important in teams, and cultural change is important as well. You're changing the culture, hopefully, in the positive way of your organization. Well, what makes up some of the better teams? And this comes from my experience, it comes from reading, etc. It comes from a variety of sources. But the best teams have a common purpose, and they support common causes. Probably the best team I ever had at the university was made up of a series of young faculty members. I was hired at Ryerson University when I was 24 years of age. I was younger than most of the students I was teaching. And very soon, that department hired a number of other young faculty, most of us from the University of Toronto. And these young faculty members decided they wanted to create a program. And we were given the opportunity to do that. And I've never had a more committed, a more energetic, a more passionate group of people working towards a common goal. We were naive in a number of ways, but what we were not naive in was passion, commitment, engagement, collaboration, cooperation, wanting to get it done, and we wanted to succeed. And we wanted to create something new. And that was a very, very powerful moment. Within 3 years, we had a degree program at a university which had never had a new degree program before. And we were all under 29 years of age. That was a powerful message. Now, that group went on to do a variety of things. One became a university president, one went on to become a deputy minister, one came on to become an associate dean, one became a dean, blah, 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 blah. They were very, very committed and passionate people. But I think that experience created a real impact on all of us and probably made us people who wanted to succeed somehow, made us maybe sowed the seeds of leadership. One of the things I certainly found out about teams and how they work is you really have to to be accountable and responsible. Teams have to be accountable and responsible. You have to communicate, you have to follow process that's established by the organization, and you have to abide by good governance. If you don't deal with those three basic things of communication, process, and governance, which are all in effect bona fide, you can be challenged, and challenged legitimately. And the worst thing a team wants to hear if they're implementing or suggesting a plan, well, we didn't know about it. Unless you're working on some secret team activity, I suppose, and they are generally suspicious. I've often found that team size is important. Smaller teams perform better than larger teams. And I often thought a team member somewhere between 12 is at the optimum high and 5 is at the minimum low, but some 7 or 8, 9 members is a great team, and it works very, very well. Difficult thing to do is minimize politics, and that's the self-interest. That is a really team-destroying element. And understand what that politics, how it's developed. Some is in a passive-aggressive way. Some team members can be very passive-aggressive. Some can be a bully. And some, in effect, can be non-participant. But you really have to deal with those challenges as they arise. The team is the most important thing, not the individual. More people, rather than fewer people, sometimes make better decisions. And I think as whoever's organizing the team or chairing the team has to listen, they have to hear, and they have to probe. And not to do that is, I think, again, suicidal. And again, often some of the most difficult things in team building or making decisions is looking for missing data. Thinking you have all the information. That takes time, that takes reflection, that takes a variety of things. But effective teams go beyond and look for what's missing. What have we missed? What information is not there that we need? Where can we get that information? And it's often the most difficult thing. And that, I think, is something I've learned. And how to respond to challenges and how to provide solutions to complex problems. Those are the things teams do. Respond and, in effect, provide solutions to complex problems. Every organization has them. This organization has complex problems. Universities have complex problems. Some are similar, some are different. But how are you facing those particular complex problems? You generally don't do it from the executive floor. You do it by building teams which reflect the membership, and they, in effect, it's a two-way street. Well, what are some of the characteristics of ideal teams? Well, they get things done. They succeed. They make things a little better than they were before. I think, obviously, they ask difficult questions. They have the ability to seek information. They embrace diversity. That's increasingly becoming an important part of being a Canadian. And we can't go very far south of the border to look at how diversity in some things are not being embraced. And it's certainly this separation, I think, between, in some cases, the two parties. I think teams ideally have to be visionary. They have to think, they're often forward think. They have to build internal and external partnerships. Good teams are able to reach out and draw things in. Good teams have networks. And I know when these young faculty members were building a new program, we had networks in various universities across the country. We reached out to those. And we were welcomed. People fed us back. So the ability to get feedback is a responsibility of a team, I think, but it also reflects who you put in the team. Do they have networks? Are they respected outside or within the organization? Can they go out and talk to other people and people will be open to them? Can they be trusted? All fundamental issues. And increasingly we talk about, and obviously in this group I don't have to talk about it, but ethical decision making. And I didn't think I had to talk about that in universities, but I did. Well, how do you build these things? Well, you select well. I said interview well, but you select well. You don't rely on yourself always to make the selections. You talk to people. I don't think you can teach passion. I think passion for what the team is about has to be there. And you can tell who has passion, who doesn't have passion. We've all probably been on sports teams. And good sport teams have a certain passion about them. They want to succeed. They want to win. And in some cases, win at all costs. I don't know if that's passion or simply damn desire, but you don't want to lose. In most cases, I didn't hire or I didn't bring specialists into the team. We sought specialists to advise the team. I wanted people who thought more broadly, who were big vision thinkers in some cases. And if we needed some expertise, we brought it in and got the expertise. Urgency sometimes can be a problem, particularly in the contemporary world we live in. Slowing down is important, I think, sometimes. Reflection's important, and what a better place to think of reflection than a cathedral. But reflect, and we don't often reflect enough. People rush to decisions. And I would suggest resist that in some cases. And again, diversity, cognitive diversity is important. People with different competencies, different backgrounds. You don't want to clone yourself. One of the teams at a university that is most important, and I think one of the worst teams we have, is hiring committees. Hiring committees tend to clone themselves. And they're besides being a bit of a crapshoot, hiring people, hiring committees, I think, are one of the real problems that organizations face. They really are. And at a university, you're hiring people for, hopefully, if they get tenure, for 35 years. At a university hiring committee, you're making a decision. It's a multi-million-dollar decision. Multi-million-dollar, because of the tenure process. We could discuss tenure here, but I'm sure your views may be different than mine. Other team building, fight complacency, encourage constructive dissent. I was very aware of groupthink. I was very aware initially of people wanting to please the dean. I didn't want to be pleased. In many cases, I wanted to be challenged in a positive way. I wanted people to suggest why perhaps my idea wasn't the best. I really did encourage that. And I think that is part of leadership. It's part of creating a meritocracy. Leadership is not about an aristocracy. Leadership is about a meritocracy. Leadership is about that. Teams are about that. Reward and celebrate. That sometimes you have to purge a team or an organization. It's not a pleasant thing. But it helps to create an environment which I think allows everyone to behave more effectively, more respect, and not pleasant things, but sometimes you have to purge teams, purge organizations. And that's about leadership as well. Now, I met with one of the people I've worked with recently was a very major executive in one of the major banks in Canada. He rose to a very, very powerful position. One time I think he was employing over 35,000 people. And he's written a really important book, I think. It's called Closing the Mind Gap. And his name is Ted Gatsby. He was with the CIBC Bank. And Ted is a very interesting man. He's a philosopher, a banker who's a philosopher. Well, I'm a business dean that was a geographer. Maybe that's why we connected. We probably should never have got where we ended up. But he talks about this notion of constructive dissent. Constructive dissent. And it's this notion of openness, sharing roles, transparency, and collegiality. But it's the notion that the leader constantly wants feedback. The team leader seeks feedback. You generally want to get a diverse set of people around the table. Diversity is important. Diversity of ideas, diversity of culture, diversity of age, diversity of gender, whatever. Diversity is important. You want to represent different cultures around the table. And you respect in that process those differences. It allows you to be a little more intelligent, perhaps, in dealing with complexity. You're more open to change, perhaps, than you normally would have been. You're viewing the context of the situation in a much more multivariate way. Because all of us come with biases. All of us come with cultural baggage, if you want. All of us come with built-in, if you want, receptors. And under this notion, the team has to be comfortable with change. And not everyone is comfortable with change. And in an environment that is changing so quickly, I don't know how you can have an effective organization if you're not dealing with change. How you're not at least respectful of change, responding to change, comfortable with multiple opinions and multiple options. And all you can do is seek out what you think is the best, because doing nothing is the worst, perhaps. I guess you can do worse than what you're doing, but ultimately, if you have good people around the table, I think you can at least make a better informed decision. And certainly most of my research was about informing decisions. That was, as a researcher, I informed decisions with spatial data about investment opportunities. But informing decisions, I think, requires constructive dissent. And reflect your own organization, how much constructive dissent is there? Whether it's in your own business, whether it's in your family life, whether it's in organizations you, in effect, associate with. And certainly, I encourage constructive dissent, I think, as a dean. I try to, anyway. Now, this is another approach. It's called, and this is something that, radical candor. This is almost un-Canadian. But it does fight some stuff. It fights manipulative insincerity. You know, I thought a lot of people sometimes tried to manipulate me by being insincere. I guess I've done it all. But it's being challenging. It's challenging people. It's challenging people for the right reasons. It's criticizing sometimes individuals within the team when they've made a mistake. And as a team member or as a leader of a team, I think it's your responsibility, if not your obligation and moral obligation, to give them feedback, to be very, if you want, candid. It can be humble, it can be humbling, it can be helpful. But if you're going to criticize someone, you do it in private, you don't do it in public. If you're going to praise someone, do it in public. But make sure the team is well aware that they can operate within this environment. And it's a level beyond the constructive dissent. It's radical candor. It's radical. And I don't think I ever quite got there. But many U.S. organizations do. And it's how you really do, I think, have a team that really is challenged constantly. But it's a really un-Canadian thing. It's a much more American thing. And ultimately, you can use this as a way of performance. It hopefully reduces backstabbing. When the team disbarks, there's a group around the water cooler really saying what they mean. It's an environment where the leader makes sure that the manager, if you want, gets the feedback. And how many times as a team leader or as a leader of an organization you really have to give feedback to someone that isn't the best. And quite often, how do you do that? Think about it yourself. In the past, how have you given negative feedback? Direct and negative feedback. And then, not just the feedback, get the response in terms of addressing the concerns. How have they responded to the feedback? And those are, what's your plan of correcting this? And that's how I think organizations maybe should operate, but I don't think many do. Very important thing about teams is how rules for decision making. How do you reach consensus? How do you decide? Are the votes open or are they anonymous? The decision rules have to be agreed before. These things aren't things you make up during, I don't think. And consensus is what we use at a university normally. Everyone agrees the process is transparent. All views have been heard. Good information was used. And at the end, all participants support, although not everyone agrees, is necessarily happy. I guess that's what Donald Trump isn't doing now. He's not going to, as I understand it, support a candidate if it's not Donald Trump. Even though earlier, I gather, consensus was reached, and it's part of the process, then you will. But consensus is an important thing. But at some point, you have to go beyond the discussion and agree that we're moving forward. Charles, I understand you were not in agreement with this decision, but Charles, you've had your time. We've heard you several times, and I'm afraid we're moving on. We understand you're perhaps not going to be happy with this, but you're going to support the decision. Aren't you, Charles? Now, the other ways of doing it is through voting itself, and we have the supermajority rule, which is generally 75%. We have the legislative majority, which is 67%, two-thirds majority. And we have the simple majority, 50% plus one. Again, define what the rules are beforehand. And those are important for teams. They're important for organizations. I'm going to pick up on a few things Nancy talked about very briefly, but successful teams have to deal with conflict resolution. At the team level, it's generally differences of opinion. Generally differences of opinion. How are you going to deal with differences of opinion? Negotiations. At the team level, it's different. Generally, how you come to consensus, how you move on, how do you conclude? Because teams have to conclude at some point. So how do you agree to conclude? That's negotiation sometimes. The ability to find information and missing information, and how to run a meeting. Teams have to be led, generally. And I totally agree with Nancy. I can remember when I was very young, a chair of a department. And that was the team. And I was not the leader. I was getting the stipend. I was getting the extra $10,000. I think at the time it was $2,000. But the real leader of the team was that guy in the corner who was very quiet, and he had the moral authority. Everyone looked to Ron, and I looked to Ron too. Because if Ron agreed, we generally thought it was a pretty well thought out idea. Ron never wanted to be the chair. Ron just was a very thoughtful, guiding, moral individual. And he was a wonderful person, but he was the moral authority. And so the teams, you have to, how to run a meeting, but how to, in effect, engage people, and ultimately, who really has power within the organization. There are some, I suppose, team-building strategies that you can use. Listen to all voices. Every conversation is important. I truly believe that. You try to be transparent. That means skipping the politics. That's very difficult to do in any organization, how you skip the politics. You have to make sure you provide everyone an opportunity to participate. You have to be, finally, decisive. You have to respond. You have to provide solutions. You have to provide advice, whatever it is. And you have to encourage diversity. And you have to expand the decision space. You have to, in effect, get beyond the groupthink. Groupthink is a terrible thing. A terrible thing. And obviously, the role of the chair is important in all of this. And chairs are very special people. They have the ability to foster high-quality discussion. They have the ability to tell people to, where we've heard Charles. Thank you, Charles. Thank you again, Charles. Now it's time to hear Bill. They have to be, I guess, aware of the quality of the discussion. When the discussion is breaking down. When to call an end to the meeting. And I had a rule that when the team met, the most important things were discussed first. Because that stopped people coming late. And what's more disruptive to a team meeting? When consistently, time after time after time, Charles comes late. And then Charles wants to be caught up, and Charles is probably the first one to talk. But you generally shut the door and you don't let him in. That works too. after Charles Vance. Why didn't you let me into the meeting? But the key is knowing when to conclude, when the job is done. I'm going to end with some quotes because I'm done now. But the difference between success and failure of an organization, as I said earlier, is a great team. Helen Keller, alone we can do little, together we can do much. Henry Ford, coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, working together is success. John C. Maxwell, a very famous business authority, teamwork makes the dream work, but vision becomes a nightmare when the leader has a big dream and a bad team. And finally, from the owner of J.C. Penney, James Cash Penney, the best teamwork comes from those who are working independently towards one goal in unison. Individual thought bringing together to create unison. No groupthink. Individuals who, in effect, are there for their intellect, their contribution, and their advice. And finally, the last one from Ken Blanchard, none of us is as smart as all of us. So remember, foster constructive dissent, fight groupthink, pursue integration, slow down, and facilitate discussion. I thank you for your being here.